The Solar Podcast is brought to you by Continental Energy Solutions. I'm Tim Montague, your host. Today on the Solar Podcast, the ecological value stack of native landscaping on solar farms. Water quality, soil carbon, pollinator, and wildlife-friendly habitat are the most obvious three stacks that we're going to explore today. My guest today is Tom Karras with Minnesota Native Landscapes. Welcome to the show, Tom.
Hey, it's great to be here, Tim.
Really appreciate you coming on. And, we've talked about pollinator and wildlife friendly on a couple different shows. We had Fresh Energy on with Rob Davis. And so I'm committed to doing more and better shows on this topic. But you guys are real experts in native landscaping. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and also about Minnesota Native Landscapes?
Sure. So I've been with Minnesota Native Landscapes for about a year after really being in the trenches of utility scale solar construction for the last 4 or 5 years. I had Minnesota Native Landscapes as my landscape contractor on projects before, and it just became a real nice fit to join them, especially now with the amazing growth that we're seeing, especially here in the Midwest. Minnesota Native Landscapes is a 20-year-old ecological restoration company that formed a solar division back in 2015. Minnesota was lucky. We had the largest solar project in North America that year was the Aurora project developed by Enel. And it was 150 megawatts over 16 sites, and that kind of threw this state into what it was like to deal with utility scale solar. Since then, because of this extremely robust community solar program that the state created, there's over 400 active sites, solar garden sites now. And I'm happy to say that we've got the greatest market share of anybody out there as far as servicing all those sites, then doing installation work on new sites.
Excellent. Yeah, I'd love to talk a little more about Aurora and in general, just for our listeners, Minnesota was an early mover in especially community solar here in the Midwest, I think starting in 2012. So you're almost a decade into the community solar market. So you're definitely a shining star here in the Midwest. You mentioned 400 projects, several gigawatts of solar are now on the ground, and then also with pollinator friendly, right? Minnesota did create a pollinator friendly checklist early on and has been a shining star or an aspirational peer for other Midwestern and other states across the country. That is one of the best practices, of course, in pollinator and wildlife friendly solar development, is to develop a checklist, to be explicit about how do you achieve a landscape that's going to be meaningful ecologically. So, I mentioned in the introduction these three value stacks of soil, carbon, water quality. It's both water quality, of course, and reducing stormwater runoff, just the sheer amount of stormwater that is running off the land. We want to reduce that because that's going to have many ultimate goods. And then, of course, pure habitat for insects, for birds, and other wildlife that are reliant on plants. And habitat is a complicated word, but it boils down to plants that produce food, whether it's seeds or pollen or nectar for those animals. Tell us more about Minnesota Native Landscapes. You say you're doing the work. Obviously there's several phases to solar farm landscaping. There's the planning and design phase, there's the implementation, and then there's the operation and maintenance. So why don't you tell us about your services in those areas?
What our big push is right now, Tim, is to get the concept of vegetation planning just accepted as one of those things that really needs to be moved ahead and incorporated into the development cycle itself, as opposed to something that, you know, is the last pages on your plan set that the EPC looks at as an almost afterthought, or, oh my gosh, we got to do this too. There's, as what you're helping to show, there's a lot of values that good vegetation planning can bring to neighbors and the site itself. There's also a great amount of information, and right now I've got 5 years of invoice history that shows that we can create a very vibrant vegetation space that's also going to be your least cost option going forward. Thinking about these things as 20 or 25-year power plants, and you only want to do this vegetation thing once. You may come back and then replace inverters a year 12, but you really only get one good shot at the vegetation. And what I've got a bunch of really smart guys here, and they are very much, they're scientists for the most part. They really take this job seriously. They're great at planning, they design, they evaluate, and then it's a matter of getting the industry to buy into what should be a win-win for everybody. So we've been involved all the way through, from designing to installation. Now we're, good chunk of our business is going back to projects that failed with other companies' installation, and we are reseeding and revegetating sites. So we're pretty much there on the whole bit.
Yeah, I think of native planting of solar farms as a form of ecological restoration, because for the most part, we're taking land, whether it's prime farm ground or subprime farm ground that's been in the CRP program. It's land that is no longer, for the most part, in native landscape, and you're taking it then, let's just say worst case scenario, from prime farm ground, corn and beans here in central Illinois, to then tall grass or short grass prairie. Unfortunately, tall grass really doesn't work so well for solar farms because we don't want the array to get shaded by the plants. Are your roots at MNL in ecological restoration?
Yes, very much so. And the height requirements come up, you know, all the time. That is a very specific thing, but it's important for the industry and everybody to understand that there's hundreds of different seed options out there, and they all have height characteristics. So you can take a seed specialist can put together a seed mix that will meet what you need as far as height requirements. And it's a matter of understanding what has grown there in the past, what's grown there during construction, and then what we can do with it afterwards. I'll say one thing, we don't really have a lot of the CRP land going into solar. What we generally have, and this kind of pissed me off when I was a construction manager, that we would always invariably be stuck at the bottom of a hill trying to build a solar project that was nothing but mud. And I would go back to my developer land guys and say, you've got to get me better property. You've got to have better property. And they go, sorry, Tom, this is all the farmer's going to give us. We're going to get his worst property because he knows that if he doesn't get it to us, somebody else is going to be knocking on his door. So the service that at least is my experience here in Minnesota is that we're helping out the farmer for the most part, taking his least productive acreage and really turning it into his highest revenue acreage. And hopefully leaving that CRP land to do what it was intended to do. But that will probably start evolving into projects as well.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit about siting because it's not easy for lay people, say landowners, to understand the factors involved in siting a solar project. First and foremost, you want to be close to infrastructure. You need to be close to three-phase power lines. You, for larger projects, need to be close to substations, and so that's really the beginning. Is the developers are looking for land that is close to electrical infrastructure. Then of course you need contiguous parcels. You need large swaths. I mean, I have a solar farm in my backyard here that is 1,600 acres. That's a 150 megawatt project. Illinois is bifurcated. We have a community solar market, which is 3 megawatt DC. These are 15 and 20 acre sites. And then we jump to 100 to 400 megawatt projects. And those you're looking at, 1,000 acres pretty much at the low end. And while it's nice to think that the solar developers might think about what land specifically they would be using, they really care more about the location and the infrastructure. And then, okay, is it flat enough? How much grubbing has to be done to clear the land? And that's again where farm ground is great because it is being cropped and there's not a lot of woody vegetation, which is just more work, of course, to remove in order to plant your solar piles. Anything else you want to say about that?
No, I mean, this is a least cost gain. Just like you said, the closer you can get to infrastructure, the least amount of effort to make that project, viable. It's very interesting to see the mathematical gymnastics that are going on now with all our fixed tilt used to be run with the land setups that you could handle more undulation. As you work into more single axis trackers, you've got different types of slope requirements to make the trackers work. And it went from an east-west layout to a north-south, question. But no, it's all about the dollars, as it should be. And it's experience too, and we've certainly had a bunch of it.
I'm going to share your website on screen. You've got a beautiful photograph of a prairie here on your landing page. Let's kind of walk our listeners through the development process from a landscaping perspective. Solar farms take years to develop. And one of the questions is, at what point do they start working with professionals like yourselves on the seed list, for example? And I want to hearken briefly to a comment you made about the cost of the installation, because it is a misperception that doing native landscaping is going to be more expensive than just turf grass. I know full well from experience now on a project in Joliet where we did a side-by-side. The turf grass seeding requirements are much greater. You need many more pounds of turf grass seed, and that drove the cost of the installation higher than using a native plant mix. But when developers approach you, what do you say about, well, when do your services start in an ideal world?
What the standard development sequence, as we see it, is at some point a developer has identified what could be a suitable piece of property, and then he's going to bring in engineers that are going to do some pre-construction work, evaluation of the site. You've got to do all those things about identifying if there's any endangered species, mammals or plants. You've got to find out what the chemical makeup is of the soils. Obviously, you've got to do pull tests and that sort of thing, and just a bunch of pre-construction work. And part of that usually involves some sort of existing plant inventory or what's growing on the site now. And and sometimes they leave it at that. And then the next phase, some engineering firms will add to that, that here is what you can do, and that's good for an engineer to do. And then, you know, we need engineers in the world, but they're not always thinking about what it takes for the actual installation. And what I think we bring, what Minnesota Native Landscapes brings to the table at that stage of development is really a boots on the ground installation perspective as to what's going to work, what's has a better chance, where, you know, what the timing on some of these large projects is really, really important, whether you can set it up so you can pre-seed or you're seeding after construction. I think our best position is to come in after a developer has a pretty good sense that he's got a viable project, that we can come in and work with the vegetation consultant that they probably already have on board, but we bring that actual installation experience to the project. And then we've taken it from there. We obviously want to get the installation job, but we also want to help the neighboring infrastructure. That's why, you know, we bid projects in Illinois. We're doing installation there, but admittedly, there are landscaping crews there that don't have as much experience in working on solar projects. We want to work with that local community. You know, keeping things as local as possible is going to keep costs down. Is, you know, if this industry is all about being able to keep the money in the local economy, we can help educate. So our best space is to get in early, be the boots on the ground perspective on the planning, you know, and that I think also can go a long ways toward giving your developer guys all the ammunition they need when they're talking to the planning commission and the town boards about, here are the qualities that we're going to bring to this site. And we're actually going to see, you know, we will actually be able to see a benefit to the site itself over time, and then show the benefit to the neighbors as well.
Yeah. So, you know, looking at your service suite, which kind of paints a picture of the different stages, you've got consultation and design. So that's the early stage. You've got construction services, excavation and grading services, vegetation management, conservation grazing program. I know you're very involved in agrivoltaics and running sheep on solar farms, so we want to dig down on that. But let's talk a little more about implementation. Once you have a good design, a good plant list, do you have a preference for spring versus summer versus fall construction?
Wow, we very, very rarely get the choice. You know, we're working on some large projects right now in southern Minnesota. The best case scenario is what we try and aim our clients toward. And if they want to keep the farmer getting as much use out of his property as long as possible. If he came in, was able to harvest crops in the fall, and then be able to seed in a cover crop, and potentially a cover crop that also has some of our native grasses and such to it, so that in the spring, what you're going to end up working on after melt is that you've got a project, a site that has some basis for being stabilized. It's got that annual cover crop is coming up. We've started, you know, the process of getting the natives established, and it gets them one step closer toward that establishment. Getting to establishment means you can take your SWIP controls down quicker. I mean, that's one of the cost savings that can come into this. If we can get you out of your SWIP permit sooner than later, that's a good thing. So yeah, if we could if we could have that opportunity to do a fall planting, and then you can go, boy, if you're driving piles, the first part of winter, constructing the spring, and then it's a matter of our main, if we always love to come in and be able to do major seeding right after piles go in. But if we can't, we've got to seed afterwards. I mean, this is the solar industry. Everything's up in the air all the time. But that would be our best case scenario, is to get something started in the fall to keep because the spring mess is just that. We want to avoid all that erosion and what, equipment is going to do to the soils. And if we can establish something that way, that's our best case scenario. But you got to work with what you got.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly here in Illinois, there was a rush of construction just after the fall harvest. And sometimes there is a decent amount of corn stubble left on the ground to at least prevent there from being a muddy mess. You're suggesting that you like to plant a cover crop. How quickly can a cover crop get established?
It can either start coming up, or it will start coming up as soon as possible in the spring.
Mm-hmm.
That's the key, getting that. And I'll also say that if you can aim your farmer towards soybeans instead of corn as the last crop that goes in, that's going to make a huge difference. You wouldn't have to till in the corn stover, to try and take the trip hazard away, if nothing else.
Mm-hmm.
Beans are good, corn not so much.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, I mean, these farm fields are not completely flat, right? There are rows from the farming practices. There's a little bit of terrain, and so if there's ways to level that out that are ecologically friendly, we want to do that. So you're getting a cover crop planted in a perfect world. You're seeding with the native seed mix in the fall. You're doing construction. It's getting torn up, of course, during construction. Then you're coming back in the spring and doing another planting. Let's talk about the establishment in your mind. How long does it take to get a good native plant seed mix established?
I think everybody, regardless of the timetable that you get started, just set the expectation for 3 growing seasons.
Mm-hmm.
There is, you get what you pay for, you get what you wait for as well. And this is not a turf grass thing that's going to come right up. This is important. This is valuable crops that take some hand holding. What you're going to see in the first year is mainly it's a invasive weed control. There's going to be vegetation that has remained in that soil. There's seed stock that comes in from the neighboring properties that has to be controlled with herbicides so it doesn't crowd out this native population that you're trying to get established. You may get one cutting that first year. The second year, you're doing hopefully a little less herbicide work, and you're going to start seeing your forbs pop a little bit. There'll be any number of, it's really something. I mean, everybody, the industry is mature enough that people need to get out and look at 5-year-old solar projects and just walk them, get out and realize that, yes, who planted this cottonwood tree here? A cottonwood can come up, be 4 or 5 feet high in the first year.
Yeah.
It came in on the wind, buddy.
Yeah.
You're being attacked from the outside. But it takes that type of monitoring. And yeah, 3 years, we aim, our plan here, our goal here is to give our clients a guarantee that within 3 years, they've got a 75% coverage of their plot, of their project, of the seeds that we planted. And if they don't, we will replant it at our own expense. But we only give that guarantee if we get to babysit it for that period of time. You know, the best installation can still go south if somebody doesn't take care of it.
So in the establishment phase, you're using herbicide and mechanical mowing and spot cutting to keep out the weeds and the woody vegetation. Weeds grow voraciously here in the Midwest. We have such fertile black soil. And that's, you know, frankly, one of the challenges that developers face here if they're coming from the Southwest or coming from the East Coast. They just have no idea what's going on with the soil and what a problem weeds can be. So you have to be very vigilant about weeds and very proactive, because they will completely shade out the native plants, right? If you just plant it and let it go, you can pretty much forget about it.
Right. Yeah, it's a war zone out there. You gotta help the good guys.
Yeah. So just thinking chronologically here, though, is there anything else? We're up to the installation and now maintenance establishment phase. Is there anything else that you want to address for our audience about those about that?
Other that, we do have a lot of interest in our grazing program. And again, it's about setting the expectation, and we can set you up, we can schedule you with hundreds or thousands of animals. But it's going to be year 2, probably year 3 before you get to, you know, have that great photo op with the sheep on your project. But once they're, so that's just one more element that comes into it. But it takes that establishment period, and then the sheep as well as your long-term plan comes into effect.
So let's talk about grazing. I'm on the conservation grazing program page of your website, and I don't know if you distinguish between conservation grazing and other types of grazing. Is that a technical term, conservation grazing?
I don't think so. I think it's just grazing itself is a less impactful way that you can create vegetation management. And it's beneficial for a whole host of reasons that you can't get by mechanical means.
Yeah, so putting large animals like, I think as we've discussed, the most common is sheep that are used on solar farms, right? Let's talk, how does that work? What are the benefits to the sheep? What are the benefits to the solar farm owner?
Couple, all right, so let's put it in context of what one of our, we have a bunch of 1 megawatt sites here that we put sheep on. And if you can imagine 2 livestock trailers that we can come, open up the gates, set up some control fencing, and offload a couple, 300-400 animals. And they're going to have, on that 1 megawatt site that's probably 10 acres, they're going to be there depending on what the vegetation status is at the moment. They're going to be there for anywhere from 4 to 7 days, and they're coming back out. So first of all, we are in and we are out with the animals. That's our, we do what's called targeted grazing. The great thing about the sheep is that they go in, and if you set up your seed mixes properly, they're going to take care of everything. And they're going to take care of everything everywhere. When I talk to my clients on cost, O&M expense, I can look them in the eye and say, listen, I can put the sheep on your site for the same cost that we can dispatch trailers and mowers and tractors to take care of the veg. But what you don't need is for the weed whipping crew to show up afterwards to clean up all the stuff around the piles, around the equipment pads, the inverter racks, all the trimming work that has to take place after mechanical mowing. That's not needed. The sheep trim it all. So that's the primary space where we believe that we can show 10, 20% cost savings over mowing, just because you don't have to dispatch that extra crew. The other things that the sheep bring to the site are pretty obvious. They're bringing fertilizer while they're there. Their hooves are crunching up the soil. One of the great things in the springtime is that a lot of time you'll have a lot of thatch, dried vegetation matter that's down. That's a potential fire risk. The sheep can go and all of that will get crunched up and broken up and will decompose quicker. And then overall, you have that great story that this once piece of agriculture land is still in agriculture. We're still creating a livestock value that ends up in the local meat markets. The sheep are, but it took a while. We've got a number of years into it. We've got a flock of about 1,500 sheep right now. We've got them all bred to being a shorter legged version that has a short coat. And they don't complain much, and they don't spit rocks. They're great guys. I love them.
The rock spitting you're referring to, of course, a mechanical mower, right? That can, the blades can throw rocks that can hit the solar panels and cause damage. So you're arguing that for solar farm, for native landscaping, maintaining with sheep improves the cost by 10 to 20%. Is any kind of native vegetation going to be appropriate for the sheep, though? I mean, there's a variety of plants in a native planting, including grasses and forbs. I assume that the sheep are really hungry for grass more than anything. Is that something that folks need to think about?
The sheep are kind of like your kids or your teenagers. They're going to go out and they're going to eat all the candy first, and then they're going to, go to the French fries. And the last thing they're going to do is the vegetables. But they're hungry and they're going to eat what's there. They will eventually work their way in. You're absolutely right. There are some seed mixes that we come up with that are aimed at grazing. But there are a few Canadian thistle, a couple other things that again are probably are invasives that they won't touch. But for the most part, they will give you 100% mow on your site.
And what about the mechanical design of the solar array? Do developers need to take in or include certain specifications like array height or other wiring technologies to make the solar field more animal friendly?
I'll say that primarily here, we look at a 28 to 36 inch leading edge height that's primarily based on snow accumulation. That works just fine for the sheep. They can glide right underneath that. Again, back from my construction background, I was kind of hesitant about having PV wire available or exposed in any way. I'm thrilled to say that I've spent a lot of hours with these guys and they have no interest in chewing on wires, exposed wires. The biggest thing that we're facing now is what do you do with drive lines? And drive lines for trackers are both a concern for our sheep, but are also just a real pain for the mowers. If you're going to have mechanical mowing, drive lines, you just got to realize it's a back and forth operation instead of a straight through. But and what we do is we'll put a herbicide down underneath the drive lines so the sheep aren't congregating next to them. They're still going to slide underneath them. We'd like them to have 24 inches or so of clearance. But no, there's other parts of the design I can't, other than having a good fence. For our first interaction with a site is a perimeter walk to see how well your fence is in, and if it's already been breached, and if we have to do anything in that regard.
Okay. That's all straightforward then. No special modifications here. A best practice certainly is 36 inches. We like the lower edge of the array to be 36. I've seen it lower, but we try to go 36. And so that's great. Let's talk about this ecological value stack some more, Tom. Soil carbon, water quality, water volume, and wildlife habitat. How do we put a value on these things, and what is the delta between an industrial solar farm that just has sod versus a native landscape solar farm?
Tim, if we have to put a priority to these things, I think the carbon element really has to have top billing. I don't know about you, but I came into this industry partly because of climate change, and there's a tremendous amount of opportunity to sequester carbon. Essentially, as soon as you take a farm field out of annual tillage, you're going to start sequestering carbon. Whether it's turf grass or natives, it's going to start. We're going to be able to show, or we know, that you're going to have a greater sequestration with the more robust and the deeper rooted plant colonies that you can create. If the sheep are going to come in and help those plant colonies be more helpful, they're going to help the sequestration capacity as well. There's a tremendous amount of talk around the edges right now about how far away we are from a carbon market. What I would suggest is for folks to follow our lead. Everybody who's got a project out there should be going out and taking soil samples to start establishing a baseline for what the soil content is in their soil right now. The earlier you establish that, the greater enhancement you're going to be able to show.
How many samples does an owner need to take on a per acre basis? Is it one sample per acre or many?
And this is one of the protocols that's being discussed, by the numbers of different potential marketers out there. It's more about not a per acre, but as does the land change? I would take samples at the top of the ridge and the bottom of the ridge. Is there an area that is lower or holds more water? I would look more at the diversity of what the land is doing and make sure you get a couple samples from each of the regions, the different regions within a project. And generally what you do is you can take a bunch of small samples from a region, and then you mix them together to get a combined sample for that space.
Gotcha.
I've gone out, taken 100 samples a day. And it's different for every site. The size does not necessarily dictate the greatest amount And it'll be interesting coming out to see how the industry, the carbon market develops, and how we're going to actually engage with it.
Yeah, I think there is an emerging body of literature on farming practices that is indicating that we could sequester a very large percentage of our carbon footprint just through farmland by converting to no-till farming practices. So the fact that you're taking your solar farm, for the most part here in Illinois, certainly from greenfield corn and beans to a no-till, hopefully pollinator friendly. Most of the developers are looking at pollinator friendly. We do have a pollinator friendly checklist now. Just Google it, you'll find it. And so that all bodes well, right? For soil carbon. You know, I was interviewing Jigger Shah recently. He said we're at 0.5% on average now, soil carbon in the Midwest. We want to be at 5 to 10%. But let's talk about the benefits of that. In my mind, the soil with very little carbon is more like concrete. And then as you add carbon, it becomes more like a sponge, right? So it can absorb much more water,
Yep.
which leads to less flooding. Here in Illinois, our land is very flat, and it was historically wetland prairie. The vast majority of Illinois was wetland prairie. And so now we're trying to bring the water off the land. We've filled the land, we filled the ground with drain tiles, and then dug canals or ditches that then lead to rivers. But there were historically not a lot, of course, of those ways for the water to run off, and it sat on the land. Now it's running off, it's running into the Mississippi and creating this ginormous dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, which is just a huge disaster ecologically. So it's going to reduce the volume of water that's running off the land, and with that, the amount of nutrients that are running into the Mississippi and other major waterways. Are there other benefits of soil carbon that I haven't touched on there?
Yeah, I think there's a great marketing standpoint, that we get to, as an industry, this is another attribute that we get to claim. The clean kilowatt hours that are coming off that project are replacing or displacing fossil fuel kilowatt hours. So we are slowing down the new net increase of carbon going into the atmosphere. What soil gives us the opportunity to do is to start a drawdown of the existing carbon that's already up there. We can create that sponge, as you say, and we can pull that out. So the ability of this now, 100 acres or 1,000 acres, it's to replace existing bad energy sources, dirty energy sources, and it's also to help with that carbon that has accumulated in the atmosphere from the last 100 years. And to be able to draw down that, to get back to that 350 parts per million goal that we all should be aware of. And I want to throw in a quick plug for the documentary Kiss the Earth. 1-hour and 20 minutes, I think, pretty entertaining, but you're going to see a couple sections of video on there that very graphically show what happens when you take acreage out of an annual tilling or farm production. And you'll see the light bulb will go off of what your fenced in 25-acre solar or 25-year solar project has the capacity to bring this other value to society.
Yeah, we're taking land. Industrial farming is very hard on the land. It's also very carbon intensive, right? We're using lots of fossil fuels to fuel the machinery, to fuel the fertilizer. and to make the whole operation run, to make the seed. So converting to native landscaping makes so much sense. Are there other water quality benefits though that we need to be thinking about? I get it. It's hand in glove. As the soil carbon increases, water quality is going to increase. And then we can also talk about wildlife habitat. I'm curious on the wildlife side if there's an incompatibility between wildlife habitat and grazing. But first,
Well,
water quality, are there other components of that that we need to address here?
just the overall awareness that the stronger your plant community is, the the more it's going to be able to hold the topsoil in place. Your erosion component is reduced tremendously. It is going to start that also keeps the sheeting, these 100-year storms that are showing up every other year now are tremendously devastating. If you can slow down that sheeting of the stormwater running onto your neighbor's property, the better for them. And then also just thinking about the water, the rainwater that's going to just actually go down into the aquifer. Do you want that water to be filtered through this nice plant root community that's like this nice little sponge, or do you want it to be filtering through this dirt that's filled with fertilizers and pesticides? It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned doing a baseline on the soil carbon. I think people should also think about doing a baseline on water quality, looking at the runoff that's coming off of these fields. Because truly, after 20 years, you're going to have organic farm ground if you're using the right management practices, meaning not using a lot of herbicides and pesticides on the ground, which technically there should not be a need for if you're using the right seed mix and then have established a native plant community, which will naturally keep out weedy invasives. Let's talk about wildlife. Pollinator friendly is a buzzword, no pun intended. And we want to protect both the native insects and then economically important species like honeybees, right? Which honeybees are struggling for a variety of reasons. I don't know if we've figured out exactly what's going on with colony collapse, but it appears to be a combination of things, right? You're stacking these bads on top of the bees, and then we're having these collapses, and very large number of food crops are dependent on honeybees for pollination. Is there complete compatibility though between pollinator friendly and grazer friendly?
Sure, there can be, and you're not, it's not an either or proposition at all. The two work real well together. Obviously, we all know that the pollinators are in trouble, that we really, really need them for our food supply. And anything we can do to help is going to be good. And what we're doing is, taking that cornfield and turning it into a pollinator space. We are increasing habitat. That's going to be good. The actual metric of how much good is I know it's on the positive side. How much is being studied? I would expect, with guys like Rob Davis, we've got a lot of researchers here at the University of Minnesota, we know that NREL's involved, and a number of other great research places. But it's a little, you don't get results overnight. These are 3 and 4 year, 5 year study sessions. We're in the middle of them to be able to tell you how much and how many and what species is still, those specific details I think are still in the near future. It's very easy to say right now that it's good. It's a good thing to do. Period.
Yeah, it's just a question of making the business case obvious, right, for the long-term owners and uh, developers. I'm going to put on screen a a resource slide because I have been accumulating these resources, and it's just so important that people understand that they don't have to reinvent the wheel. Um, so you mentioned fresh energy. I mentioned Rob Davis in the introduction right here. We also have the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. They have a program called Inspire, right, Tom?
That's correct.
And that is an active research project. So that has many of the labs, like Argonne National Laboratory is involved with Inspire. Argonne is in the Chicago suburbs, and they're actively doing research on solar farms. So if
Well,
you're a solar farm developer, owner, operator, please do not hesitate to reach out to me or Tom to get specific contacts at these organizations. A few others worth mentioning: Monarch Joint Venture out of Minnesota and Wisconsin, I think. Um, they're doing research, obviously, on monarch butterflies, which are also one of the pollinators, one of the many pollinators that are struggling ecologically. The developer Engie has done a large number of pollinator friendly solar projects. They're one of the largest solar developers here in North America now. UVM, Center for Agriculture, Food and Environment. Oh, sorry, I'm jumping around here. So that was University of Vermont Extension. You mentioned University of Minnesota. The U of I here in Champaign-Urbana is very involved. They created the pollinator friendly checklist. Researcher there named Adam Dolezal. So are there other resources though, Tom, that developers should know about that are not mentioned here? I think I have a slide with some links also. So just reach out to me if you want to get these slides. Um,
no, I think that's a good list that you've got going there, Tim. And it's interesting, we just signed up a developer we work with is bringing a project in Michigan. It's going to come, Argonne is going to come out. Argonne is doing, they're more the entomologists. They're more the insect census guys. NREL is focusing a lot on the stormwater work and the actual vegetation components of these things. And let me just say, we've got one great developer that has a wonderful client, and we're working together to come up with habitat enhancements for this portfolio of solar projects. And it pushes the envelope one more little bit toward thinking about the mammals in the area, and are you impacting them, and can you help them? Is there something that you can do to provide some wintering space for reptiles and such? Is there in your initial evaluation, do you know you're in a place that the eastern sparrow is really struggling, and can you put a batch of Juneberry bushes along the northern edge of your project to help this struggling species? We are getting our industry impacts a lot of acres, and to just take the position that we owe that land a lot of respect, and there's all kinds of opportunities we have to help the land, and we should take advantage of them.
Indeed, indeed. Well, I think we'll stop there, Tom. I'm very open to having you back as a guest. This is a growing phenomenon, of course, as solar takes off here in the Midwest. We have 57 gigawatts of solar in the MISO queue alone. That's not counting the PJM territory in the Midwest. There's a huge amount of large scale solar going to happen in the next 10 years. Jiggershaw predicts $1 trillion of clean power infrastructure is going to get built per year for the next decade. So It's a wonderful opportunity for all of us in the energy industry or those moving into the energy industry to make a difference for future generations. I do want to make a few quick announcements. We bring you these interviews every week, twice a week, plus one edition of the Clean Power Hour. You can find all of this content at cesnrg.com/videos. Here you see, I did an episode recently on DC coupled storage. We did an episode with about a Nextracker Gemini project. That's a 2 and portrait tracker, land siting tools for solar developers, so many different topics, tools, and technologies. And then also the Clean Power Hour with myself and John Weaver, a former journalist with PV Magazine and a solar installer and developer in Massachusetts. So please check us out at cesnrg.com. Tom, how can our listeners reach you?
They can, you can, the way we linked up on LinkedIn, but Minnesota Native Landscapes, our website is mnnativelandscapes.com. And we're based, we're about 40 miles outside of Minneapolis in central Minnesota, covering pretty much all the Midwest now. We put a semi worth of equipment on the road for about 30 miles southeast of St. Louis, Illinois this morning. We're going to do some forestry mowing to get a transmission line cleared out. But that's, Minnesota Native Landscapes. Just Google us. We stand out. And there is, there's a great opportunity, like I said, and that you bring out in all of your messages. And I really appreciate that, you provide this venue for that. And we all, I'd like to think this industry has done a ton of work to take that cost per watt down to under $1 a watt. Well, maybe we can start seeing some of those savings and reinvesting a little bit, a half a penny, putting back into your site, to help in some of these extra values that you can help bring to society. Let's be partners with everybody on this and show them all the values that solar can bring.
Well said. Well, thank you, Tom Karras with Minnesota Native Landscapes. I'm Tim Montague, your host. Let's grow pollinator and wildlife-friendly solar. Have a great day, everybody.